In the solid e4-e5 openings, one of white's most classical and reliable weapons is the Ruy Lopez, or Spanish game. In this video, we are going to focus on less common but important lines you should know if you play either side of the Spanish. After the moves e4, taking space and preparing rapid development, black responds in kind with e5. White continues to develop and attacks the e5 pawn with knight f3. When black develops a knight and protects the center with knight c6. White has a wide variety of choices, but we reach the Ruy Lopez with bishop b5. Attacking the knight on c6, the key defender of the e5 pawn. When you play the Spanish as white, you can expect your opponent to typically play a6 or knight f6, which are solid, mostly positional responses. A radically different approach is the risky Schliemann defense, f5. Instead of building a solid position and gradually working toward equality, black decides to immediately counterattack white's center. If white accepts the pawn with e takes f5, surrendering the center, black can then charge forward with e4, when black is already fighting to take over the initiative. In response to f5, white sometimes plays knight c3, inviting incredibly sharp play. But a solid, promising option is to play the straightforward d3. Securing the center and preparing to respond to black's typical move f takes e4, opening up the f-file which black hopes to later use to create an attack. White can now maintain a pawn in the center with d takes e4. Black typically continues to develop actively and adds pressure against white's center with knight f6, attacking white's pawn on e4. White can certainly develop a piece and protect the pawn, but a stronger idea is to simply ignore this threat by castling. White is focused on rapid development, and if black tries to win material with knight takes e4, white's safer king in lead in development will punish black's attempt to win material with either rook e1 or centralize the queen first with queen e2. If black moves the knight to safety, white can simply play bishop takes c6, followed by capturing the pawn on e5, when black's position is under serious pressure. Instead, if black tries to reinforce the knight with d5, not only can white consider the disruptive c4, attacking the d5 pawn, a simple and strong choice is knight takes e5, regaining material and adding more pressure against the pinned knight on c6. Instead of trying to win material, black can play d6, which reinforces the center but prevents the dark-squared bishop from becoming active. White can then take advantage of the weakened light squares with bishop c4, taking advantage of the open a2 to g8 diagonal, one of the key weaknesses behind playing f5 so early. If black wants to activate the dark-squared bishop before playing d6, then a natural move is bishop c5, developing the bishop to an active diagonal, pointing directly at white's king. This move does offer a pawn sacrifice, which white can certainly accept with bishop takes c6, followed by knight takes e5, challenging black to prove sufficient compensation for the pawn, which is no easy task. If white would prefer to avoid complications, another interesting idea which has been played by several grandmasters is queen d3. This move helps support the center, as well as preventing black from castling, as this would allow queen c4 check, forking the king, and bishop on c5, so white would simply win a piece. Instead of castling, black should play d6, securing the center and supporting the bishop, so black is now ready to castle the king, which would help activate black's rook on the f-file. White can continue to restrain black's play with queen c4, preventing black from castling. White is now ready to take advantage of the weakened d5 square with knight c3, followed by knight d5. When white enjoys an active, comfortable position, perhaps not fighting for as much of an advantage compared to accepting the gambit, but black still has serious problems to solve. When you see your opponent play f5 on the third move, this is definitely not a move to fear, and with proper play, white can expect a safe, comfortable advantage. Instead of the radical f5, a more reliable option for black is a6, immediately putting the question to white's bishop. White's most popular choice is to play bishop a4, but sometimes white plays the exchange variation with bishop takes c6. Black's most reliable response is d takes c6, opening up the queen on the d-file, as well as liberating the light-squared bishop. White does not play the exchange variation to win a pawn, because after knight takes e5, Black can attack white's unprotected knight and e4 pawn at the same time with queen d4. White should retreat the knight to safety with knight f3, when black regains the pawn with queen takes e4 check. Attacking white's vulnerable king, black enjoys an active position with the bishop pair, so this is not a good idea for white. The point behind surrendering the bishop pair in the exchange variation is to compromise black's pawn structure by doubling pawns on the c-file, hoping to take advantage of the superior pawn structure. One direct attempt by white is to play d4, attacking the center and provoking e takes d4. Since knight takes d4 allows c5, forcing white to trade queens under less favorable circumstances, white's typical response is queen takes d4. Black has several options at this point, but a simple and effective plan is to exchange queens and prepare to castle queenside with queen takes d4. Knight takes d4. We now see a clear picture of what white wants to accomplish in the exchange variation. By provoking e takes d4, white now enjoys a healthy pawn majority on the king side. If all of the pieces disappear from the board, white's 4 versus 3 pawn majority has the potential to create a passed pawn on the king side by itself. By comparison, notice black's 4 versus 3 pawn majority on the queen side cannot force a passed pawn by itself thanks to the doubled c-pawns. This dream scenario is unlikely to happen, as black's 2 bishops promise good counter chances. Play can now continue with bishop d7, developing the bishop and preparing to castle queenside. If black decides to play c5, it's possible the bishop will become active with bishop c6. We'll also see this bishop can support a potential f5 pawn break when it's properly timed. White can continue to develop with the centralizing move bishop e3, when black continues with the plan by castling queenside. If white decides to play knight c3, then black can activate the kingside quickly with bishop b4, pinning the knight to white's king. White usually avoids this option by playing knight d2, preserving the option of c3 if black plays bishop b4. This is not a particularly challenging line for black, who enjoys a useful bishop pair in solid position. One idea is to place pressure on the center with rook e8, preparing to dislodge white's knight from its central post with c5, and once the knight no longer controls f5, black can then open up lines, a good idea with the bishop pair, with f5. Since the direct d4 doesn't promise white anything special, a more common approach is to remain flexible by castling. Now that white has castled the king out of the center, knight takes e5 is a potential threat. Black has several ways to respond, including the somewhat strange-looking but solid f6. Black can play bishop d6, or defend the pawn with the queen, moving it to d6 or f6, just to name some of the interesting options. One straightforward line for black is to pin the knight with bishop g4. If white doesn't play actively, black can reinforce the center with f6, play queen d7, and castle the king queenside, preparing a dangerous kingside attack. A sensible response for white is to put the question to the bishop immediately with h3. It may come as a surprise for white that black has no intentions to respond to this threat, and instead can play h5. This is known as the fishing pole trap, as white should not accept the bait with h takes g4, allowing h takes g4, as this opens up the h-file leading to white's king. White has no choice but to return the piece, accepting an inferior position, because if white tries to save the knight with a move such as knight takes e5, black can play the crushing queen h4, threatening checkmate. And if white tries to create an escape square for the king with f3, the fate of white's king is now sealed with g3, when checkmate is unstoppable. Instead of accepting the piece sacrifice, white should focus on completing development with d3. Black can continue to develop actively with queen f6, adding pressure against the pinned knight, and also clearing the path for black's king to castle queenside. Black is now ready to play bishop takes f3, compromising white's pawn structure. Knight b to d2 is a popular, solid choice, but it does block the dark-squared bishop, allowing black to play the dynamic pawn thrust g5. If white decides to not play knight b to d2, white should avoid playing bishop g5, as this actually loses material after bishop takes f3, removing the guard of the bishop and also attacking white's queen. So if white wants to develop the dark-squared bishop, a much stronger move is bishop e3. Centralizing the bishop, when white can play knight b to d2, supporting the knight on f3. This is a good moment for black to damage white's pawn structure with the exchanges bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, queen takes f3, g takes f3, doubling white's pawns on the f-file, as well as isolating the pawn on h3. White is ready to strike in the center with f4, so black reinforces the e5 pawn with bishop d6. Although white's structure is now compromised, do not assume white is without resources. One idea is to play rook d1, when white can centralize the king with king f1 and king e2. White can play knight d2, preparing to play knight c4, adding pressure against black's center, as well as the bishop on d6. White may also consider the pawn break d4, possibly preparing this idea by first playing c3. Black, on the other hand, will usually play knight e7, preparing knight g6, eyeing the f4 and h4 squares. Black can decide to castle the king, or centralize the king, preparing for an endgame with king d7. An interesting positional struggle can be expected, with reasonable chances for both sides. Instead of resolving the tension with bishop takes c6, white's most popular option is to retreat the bishop with bishop a4, moving the bishop to safety and maintaining the tension against black's knight. Black can now centralize a knight and add pressure against white's center with knight f6, attacking the e4 pawn. White can decide to defend the pawn with d3, a solid but less ambitious choice, or else enter the main lines with castling. White continues to focus on rapid development, offering the e4 pawn to black in order to open up lines in the center. At this point, black has several choices, including the solid, classical response bishop e7, the ambitious and more risky bishop c5. Or black can also decide to capture the pawn with knight takes e4, turning the game into the open variation of the Spanish. Black is trying to achieve active piece play in exchange for having less space in the main lines. When you're starting out in the Ruy Lopez, when black plays knight takes e4 before castling, a reliable option is to play rook e1, attacking the knight, and aligning with black's potentially exposed king on the e-file. It turns out this isn't white's most promising option, but black still needs to be careful. If black tries to reinforce the knight and grab space in the center with d5, white can expose black's lack of development with bishop takes c6 check, b takes c6, damaging black's pawn structure, and then opening up the e-file with d3. When black responds with a natural move, such as knight f6, white can now open up the e-file with knight takes e5, regaining the pawn, and is also threatening the deadly move knight takes c6, attacking black's queen and discovering the rook's check against black's king. So black is in serious trouble. The reason playing rook e1 immediately isn't the most challenging option against the open variation is because black doesn't have to try and keep the pawn and can prefer to play the more solid response, knight c5, returning the pawn and attacking white's light-squared bishop. Since black has fallen behind in development by capturing the e4 pawn, it's important to focus on king safety by playing moves such as bishop e7 and castling kingside. So as long as black focuses on this safety-first plan, then white shouldn't have anything special in this position. If white wants to fight for the initiative and put the open variation to the test, then we will see the mainline response, d4. White strikes in the center, preparing to regain material and open the position to exploit the lead in development. It may be tempting to capture the pawn with e takes d4, but this opens the position to white's advantage, allowing an unpleasant pin with rook e1. It's actually better to ignore the d4 pawn for the time being and focus on creating a more stable center with b5, attacking the bishop and gaining space on the queen side. After bishop b3, now that white's light-squared bishop is no longer applying pressure against the knight on c6, black is now ready to grab a fair share of the center with d5, occupying the center, supporting the knight on e4, and opening up a diagonal for black's light-squared bishop. White is now able to regain the pawn with d takes e5, taking space and revealing the queen's pressure against the d5 pawn. Black can respond to this threat by centralizing the bishop with bishop e6, If we take a moment to evaluate the position, white's e5 pawn has secured a space advantage, and black's pawn on c7 is backward. The queenside majority will start rolling if black can achieve c7 to c5, but this is easier said than done. Black has achieved the desired minor piece activity with an active knight on e4, which may later use the c5 square to add pressure against white's bishop on b3. Black also has the option to use the c5 square to activate the dark-squared bishop with bishop c5, pointing directly at white's kingside. Modern grandmaster practice has shifted its attention to knight b to d2, adding pressure against black's knight on e4, when black can consider playing knight c5, adding pressure against the light-squared bishop when complicated play can be expected. The interested viewer is encouraged to use our Game Explorer feature to check out some of the latest games in this main line. White's traditional main line has been c3, securing the d4 square, which may help support a future knight d4. And this move also allows white's bishop to use the c2 square. One popular line that illustrates the potential piece play black desires in the open variation begins with the move bishop c5, actively developing the dark-squared bishop, applying serious pressure against the f2 pawn. White can now add pressure against black's knight on e4 with knight b to d2. Black doesn't mind an exchange on e4 when black can play the disruptive d takes e4, attacking white's knight on f3, the only defender of the important e5 pawn. So black can simply castle the king. It may be hard to believe, but by castling, black's rook is ready to support an important attacking idea. After white plays bishop c2, adding a second attacker against the knight on e4, as well as x-raying the h7 pawn, which is a potential attacking resource in the future. We now enter the Dilworth variation with the surprising but strong response, knight takes f2. It's generally not a great idea to trade two minor pieces for the opponent's rook and pawn, but after rook takes f2, instead of immediately capturing the rook, black can open up the f-file with f6, breaking down white's central clamp, so after e takes f6, the time is right to make the capture. Bishop takes f2 check, king takes f2. White's king has been attracted to the f-file when black continues to develop actively with queen takes f6. Black has exchanged two minor pieces for a rook and a pawn, compromising white's king safety, as well as opening up lines on the e and f-files for black's rooks to enjoy. Since black has scored reasonably well in the Dilworth variation, this may explain why modern grandmaster attention has shifted to playing knight b to d2 before playing c3. In the Ruy Lopez, both sides have a wide variety of interesting choices. In addition to the mainline options, we now have some ideas regarding less common but important lines such as the risky Schliemann defense, f5, and after the typical a6, white can play the less ambitious but positionally sound exchange variation with bishop takes c6, or after the mainline choice bishop a4, knight f6, and castling kingside, instead of bishop e7, leading to the main lines of the Ruy Lopez, black can play the open variation with knight takes e4. In addition to studying the mainline variations, you are now equipped with some interesting sidelines to add to your repertoire, or at least have interesting ideas ready so you will not be surprised if your opponent tries to use one of these variations against you.